Hello, my name is S Riera and I'm a clinical and researcher SLT in Hospital de Mataró. I'm going to talk about the volume viscosity swallow test, that is a clinical screening and assessment for oropharyngeal dysphagia, and I'm going to talk about the results of a systematic and scoping review of the VVST that we performed in our team. We're going to talk about the history, characteristics and evidence based of the VVST and what it involves, the algorithm, the exploration sheet and the clinical signs that we look at when we pass the test, and also the conclusions of our study. Let's start with a bit of history. It was described for the first time in Hospital de Mataró in Spain in 2008, and its first publication is a validation for a cohort of patients with different etiologies. We have found currently 38 publications from 8 different countries. It includes some variations on the test. They change viscosities, volumes, and there's one that uses a spoon instead of a syringe. And here I leave a bit of a timeline with the papers that I found more important and in bold the validations of the test. So the VVST allows us to obtain information that we need to establish a clinical screening and diagnosis of oropharyngeal dysphagia. It also let us evaluate the pathophysiology, identifying the main clinical signs and symptoms of oropharyngeal dysphagia, and also what's the mechanism that has been altered during deglutition. It also let us select the safest volume and viscosity for our patient. Sometimes we're not going to be able to perform a more objective exploration, like could be video fluoroscopy or a fibroscopic evaluation. And so the VVST is a good option to select the safest volume and viscosity to compensate our patient. It can be also performed in primary care, so we can systematically screen populations that are vulnerable for OD, like it could be our community elderly. Characteristics of this test: it's quick and it's easy to prepare. We need few material, just a syringe, water, thickening agent, and a pulse oximeter. It starts with a medium viscosity and a low volume, so it reduces the risk of our patient to aspirate during the trials. It tries different viscosities and volumes, so it gives us a better idea to decide what's the proper compensatory treatment for our patient. It also uses a pulse oximeter, so it's sensitive to detect silent aspirations, and it can be performed bedside. With the aims to assess the psychometric properties and the clinical utility of the VVST, and also to map all the publications from its first description in 2008 until nowadays, we performed a systematic review following the PRISMA methodology. Its protocol is registered in Prospero with the number that's below, and also performed a scoping review following the checking scoping review list from Cooper et al. On 2019. We use the same search strategy in 7 different databases, following 3 different lines of search for the systematic review. One about dysphagia, another one about diagnostics, and the other one about VVST, connected between them with the Boolean and the terms of each line was connected with the Boolean or. For the scoping review, we just used the VVST line and we applied it in the PubMed database. So this is a flowchart of all records identified on our databases from both searches, and then all the process of screening and selection of these records until we included them in our systematic and scoping review. So taking into account that the sensitivity is a capability of our test to find patients that really have oropharyngeal dysphagia, whereas the specificity is the capability to distinguish healthy patients inside this group of participants or patients. These are the results after a meta-analysis, where we can see the sensitivity is very high with a 95.8% for oropharyngeal dysphagia, and the specificity is not bad with a 63%, And that led us to say that VVST is a good test, has a good capability to find patients with OD, and it's also good distinguishing the healthy patients. It is important that you have in mind that the cost to misdiagnose a patient with OD is higher than misdiagnosing a patient that is healthy. So what is the international projection of these tests? So we found 5 publications that look at the psychometrics of the VVST, and we also found 33 publications that actually use the VVST, whether it was in guides and reviews to recommend it, or to check on prevalences, risk factors and complications, or also to check the effect of a therapeutic intervention. These 38 publications come from these 8 different countries that includes Brazil, Chile, China, Denmark, France, Spain, the Netherlands and United Kingdom. So in this table, I summarized the prevalence published in the different papers that we included in our reviews by phenotype of patient. So let's see, for elderly, we can go from a 25% to a 91.7% of prevalence of dysphagia, whereas for NDD, specifically for Parkinson's disease, we have a 78.9% of prevalence, and for stroke patients, we go from a 39.7 to a 56.6% of prevalence of oropharyngeal dysphagia, so very high numbers. So in here, there's the algorithm that follows the VVST. As we said before, it starts with a medium viscosity, 250 millipascals per second, and a low volume of 5 ml. And if there's no safety impairment, it continues with a higher volume of 10 ml and then a bigger bolus of 20 ml. If it's still safe, then we go through a low viscosity, that would be liquid, 0 to 50 millipascals per second, also 5, 10, and 20 ml. And it finalizes with a high viscosity of 800 millipascals per second. Take into account that if there's any impairment, any safety alteration, you would stop and go to a safer viscosity. So you would stop in nectar or liquid and jump to a high viscosity of pudding. And if you are already in pudding, then you would end the exploration. So here is the exploration sheet that we follow when we pass the test. As you can see, it includes the signs of safety, that's change in voice, oxygen desaturation of 3 points or more, and cough or clearing. Also the efficacy signs, so impaired labial seal, oral residue, multiple swallows, or pharyngeal residue. So let's see an example. Our patient has a basal saturation of 97%. We start giving him a 5 ml of a medium viscosity nectar. Everything goes well. We pass to a 10 ml. Everything fine, 20 ml, and we jump to liquid. All good, but careful because with 10 ml of liquid, our patient coughs. So we won't perform 20 ml and we will jump directly to a pudding, to a higher viscosity, 5 ml. All good, 10 ml, and finish it with a 20 ml. You can see that there's a number 2 in the 10 and 20 ml for efficacy signs in pharyngeal residue and multiple swallows, but we did not stop. We continued with the 20 ml. This is because you're just gonna stop if you see a safety impairment. So in this case, just looking at this sheet and at this test, we would say that the safest volume and viscosity would be liquid in a low volume for our patient. So yes, there is safety impairment, there is efficacy impairment, and our patient has OD. So we will use a number 1 to say that there's no alteration, a number 2 to mark something that's altered, and a number 3 if we are not performing that part of the test. So let's see an example. So I'm asking the patient to swallow, and he coughs. So he has a safety impairment. We would stop and pass to a high viscosity. Let's see another example.
Abra la boca, cierre. Trague.
So this patient also coughed. So we have a safety impairment. And let's see an example of an efficacy impairment. So in here, patient showed us her bolus because for her she already finished and it had a lot of residue and still, even after swallowing oral residue. Here we tried with food to see it more clearly. She always has oral residue. So that's not an efficient swallow. Let's go to another example.
Aguántelo allí. No trague. Bien. Trague ahora, George.
So as you could see, this patient had to swallow 3 times in order to make the bolus go down. So in conclusion, the VVST has been validated for different phenotypes of patients. It has high psychometric properties. It has a good capability to distinguish patients with OD and also healthy patients. It is reliable, so if you have 2 trained clinicians in VVST passing the same test to the same person, it would give same results or very similar. And we have found 38 studies published in different countries that used it to evaluate prevalences, complications, risk factors, and therapeutic effects. 5 of them actually recommend it as a clinical diagnostic test. And as a take-home message, I would like you to remember that OD has a very high prevalence, and so it is very important that we perform a proper diagnostic and that we screen it also. That the VVST is a clinical assessment with a strong scientific base. It has good psychometric properties and it has been validated for different phenotypes of patients. And that this is a quick test. The patient has less risk of aspiration, it's easy to prepare, and it assesses different viscosities and volumes. So it gives us information as clinicians to recommend a diet modification. And also that it can be performed bedside by any healthcare professional that is trained for it. These are some references, and thank you for your attention.